Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. The sexual revolution promised happiness and great sex, but Americans are reported as becoming increasingly lonely and unhappy. They even report having less and less satisfying sex. Rather than providing fulfilling pleasure, quote-unquote sexual liberation has created a relational wasteland in which men and women are alienated from each other in the name of individual pleasure. We're joined by Nathanael Blake to talk about this. Nathanael Blake is the author of Victims of the Revolution: How Sexual Liberation Hurt Us All. He's also a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Nathanael, great to speak with you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
I want to open by addressing something that our mutual friend Brad Wilcox, but you also cite Wendy Wang in noting that it's those people who have not espoused the narratives, the philosophical narratives and ideological pushes of the sexual revolution that continue to have thriving, not just interpersonal, intimate relationships, but also married couples, sexual encounters. And it would be easy to say, therefore, the church was right, the scriptures were right all along. But there's a grander narrative that the revolution was attempting to divorce man from natural law, and we're reaping its fruits now. So just shed some light on the topic from there.
Yeah, so simply put is that Christianity teaches us that God designed us to live in a certain way, that we were meant to live according to the natural law, which even in our fallen state, we can still apprehend portions of through our natural reason. And for most of us, our vocations are towards marriage and family, and that is where we find fulfillment. That is where we find deep relationships and meaning and purpose in this life. And it's also where we find flourishing. So by following the natural law, we avoid the pitfalls of sin, and we then make these connections that are fulfilling both in the immediate, fairly basic senses of meeting sexual desire within marriage, but also in elevating us to a relationship that cannot be had without deep commitment, without an investment of time, without the total giving of the self.
Yep. And that's precisely the reason why when you consider works of people like Stefan Zweig and his ilk, who tout that these sexual norms and moralities that govern the sexual encounter between man and woman in marriage are repressive rather than grounding them in true freedom, and you create this kind of a narrative. It's very clear that this narrative was pushed without ever considering the long-term ramifications.
Yes, I think that's correct. It's a short-term narrative for a short-term perspective. And in the ultimate long-term perspective, of course, for a Christian is looking forward to our union with Christ in the eschaton, where we see the wedding feast of the Lamb, the union of the church and of Christ, described as a wedding, as a marriage. But again, in this life, if you look at what will tend to fulfill us, and of course there are many trials that may come upon us, it's not a certainty, but it is a probability that following these, the divine plan for our lives, is more likely to leave us fulfilled and happier, and it's certainly less self-destructive.
Right. And a lot of this has been the overflowing result of what the sexual revolution pushed to do, amongst other things. There were a lot of ideological pushes. It wasn't just one core push. But amongst other things, one of the core ideological pushes was the desacralization of the sexual encounter, reducing it to nothing more than a biological, physiological activity. And therefore, what we've seen is the result of taking that which is sacred and desecrating it.
Yes, and that's what the Apostle Paul talked about when he is so revolted at the idea of shall I unite the members of Christ with a prostitute?
Right.
Because from a Christian perspective, sex matters, and our identification as believers with Christ means that to violate the norms that we have been given is a violation of Christ. And again, it comes back to marriage as something that is both very fundamental for us in this life. It is the basic building block of civilization, the family, mother, father, children. And at the same time, it also points us to that which is highest in this life and in that to come. And of course, there are these special cases of those called true vocations of chastity, and that they begin to, in a more perhaps profound way, this union with Christ in that vocation more deeply in this life. But for most of us who are called to marriage, it's, again, foundational, but it's also the pinnacle. It's where we go through the mundane elements of life, and it is also where we see glimpses of our union ultimately with God as we love Him and know Him and enjoy Him forever in the beatific vision.
And that's part of the problem with an overtly secularized culture, a culture that has embraced a kind of secular religiosity. It functions as if the transcendent isn't also at once somehow imminent. In other words, you can't live the sacred in this life, so just live as secular as possible. And this reminds me of where you wrote in your book about the great pitfall of modern Protestantism, mainline Protestantism, in believing that what the church had to say didn't have a bearing on the function of culture. Christians should keep their beliefs to themselves. And the fact is, you're dealing with very sacred realities even by secular individuals who don't embrace Judeo-Christian worldviews. And so people like David French were flat out wrong in their assertion despite their influence.
Yes, and I'm sorry to have to pick on David French. I've done it a few other times, but his withdrawal, he's a very prominent figure. He's at the New York Times now, and his sort of withdrawal from the public arena in terms of what he thinks Christianity should do. He said that, he still personally he sounds like, old line Catholic politicians on the Democrat side. I'm personally pro-life, but I'll be professionally pro-choice. He's sort of done that with same-sex marriage. He seems to have done it with transgenderism and gender ideology. But no, if we love our neighbor, then a right understanding of the natural law means that we cannot abandon reality and leave it be subjective, because these are not simply idiosyncratic religious beliefs that we're imposing on people. No, this is the fundamental order of existence. Right. Men and women are meant for each other in a lifelong union. That's not ceremonial, mumbo jumbo. That's our fundamental anthropology as human beings.
Yep.
And to ignore that in public policy and in culture is to fail to love our neighbor as ourselves.
And Nathanael, you highlight a very crucial point there, because ignoring that, in fact, I dare say more than ignoring, but willfully rejecting it, creates a mechanized caricature of the sexual act. So we're sold this facade that the people behind the camera are loving what they're doing, but as your research rightly highlights, for many of them, this was anywhere from the lowest level a chore to, at the highest level, a tremendous burden that they felt they had to keep feeding into this terrible enterprise machine.
Yes, and something I kept running into from secular sources. I was kind of surprised to learn that Paris Hilton, who for years was this sort of symbol of liberation and glamour and, kind of rich, vapid, blonde bombshell. But anyway, just surprised to learn that for years, apparently she regarded sex as a chore, but she said that.
Yep.
And then you have people like Christine Emba doing reporting and finding that this same sort of experience is repeated again and again for young women.
So let's pause there, Nathanael. My guest is Nathanael Blake, author of Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All. Continuing on the other side, stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Pete. I'm speaking with Nathanael Blake, author of Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All. And Nathanael, we were talking earlier about particular figures who, on the other side of the camera, portray this caricatured front that the hypersexualization that they sell their own bodies into is something they relish, enjoy, and savor, when the truth of the matter in their own statements is far from what they present.
Yes. So one example I was really surprised to learn in writing this book and researching that Paris Hilton, who was sort of the sexualized blonde reality TV bimbo, portrayed herself as that, actually didn't enjoy sex for years and regarded it as a chore. And I think the reason for that is that she wasn't with anyone who loved her. And then I think that is recreated across not just celebrity culture, but many young women seem to really be not enjoying this supposedly liberated culture.
Right. Catherine Kirsten's 2019 essay that you bring up highlights what I believe has seeped into the cultural water, the socio-political water, so to speak, that the imposition is girls grow up believing that as they become women, they have to be constantly sexually available for casual encounters. And that's the modern definition of womanhood. And conversely, if I may add to her insight, boys are brought up to believe that the mark of manhood is to constantly engage in meaningless, frequent sexual encounters. And so I remember teaching high school, and this language of what's your body count is something that the high school students are saying. That's a terrible way to think about, firstly, the gift of your own body, but also in juxtaposition, the bodies of the people you're encountering, because there's something sacred at play here that's completely denigrated.
Yes, there is. And it's also worth noting just how self-defeating this approach is.
Right.
As we talked about earlier, it's married Christian couples who attend church who report having more and more satisfying sex. And the reason for that is because commitment leads both to, one, someone to have as a sexual partner at the very basic level, but also it leads to a genuine love and concern and care for the other person that then manifests itself in your sex life. And Christians are in an interesting position in that, on the one hand, we believe that our sex lives in marriage is not the most important part of our lives, of our marriage. And yet, at the same time, we also recognize that it is sacred and it is important to giving of oneself to the other in love. So it's somehow we don't take it as seriously in the sense of it's not the end of life, the be all and end all of existence, but we can also take it seriously in the sense that we recognize how important it is, and that's because we believe the human person is important.
Right. And that's why, with this abject proliferation of access to pornography, down to the most perverse and hardcore versions of it, the appeal is in some sense waning. And you consider platforms like OnlyFans, this ardent hunger and desire to have a relationship, that connection that's meaningful, is what OnlyFans preys on. It plays on that, and it feeds it in this pseudo-intimate relationship. Both are left wanting, both are left empty, but that's the appeal behind it.
Yes, and it was interesting to me as I was reading articles from the New York Times, for instance, not known as a bastion of sexual conservatism, but explaining the business model and explaining what's happening in the pornography industry, where on the one hand it is becoming in many ways more violent, more degrading,
right,
and yet it's also developed this odd secondary side where it's a substitute relationship where you'll have women, or in many cases, someone pretending to be that woman because the customer service gets subcontracted out, but sending messages and so on to customers, and it is sort of a pseudo relationship, and in neither cases is good and healthy or conducive to well-being and happiness.
Right. All it does is it facilitates use on both sides, and so the pleasure principle is fulfilled for the moment, but in the end, all are left wanting, lacking, and ultimately spiraling down misery. And this leads us into that conversation of what abortion has become. We can talk about it as the fight for life in the womb, and rightly so. But if we don't address the desacralization of the body and the sexual gift that God has given male and female, that's only ever going to be one side of the argument and equation.
Yes, and so first of all, abortion is overwhelmingly a problem of people not being married.
Mm-hmm.
Ryan Anderson, president at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, has been saying in First Things and Elsewhere that abortion happens because people aren't married, and he points to the statistics showing just how few abortions are done when you have a husband and wife who are married and have a pregnancy, and it's very few statistically. Still more than we'd like, because even one is too many, but overwhelmingly abortion is about people who are not committed to each other still having sex with each other, and it's also about a devaluation of womanhood.
Right.
Insofar as women are taught that their fertility is an enemy, they are taught to view themselves as almost defective men,
right.
who, in order to compete in a world, need to become sterile, who need to be able to have the same casual attitude towards sex and the same lack of responsibility towards sex that men who are cads, to use an old word, have.
Right? And like you rightly highlight, there's a kind of almost Kierkegaardian complaint or yell into the void, complaining about the rules of natural law that revolt against us. And this is what's not highlighted that I'm really glad you brought up in your book. The sexual revolution was a violent movement. And we don't think of it that way because we don't want to acknowledge it for what it is. But tell us why it is.
Well, abortion is the violence inherent in the sexual revolution. Mm-hmm. Because the sexual revolution does not work without abortion, without the ability to bloodily, violently get rid of the tiny human lives that arise, as they are meant to, from human sexuality. You can't have the sexual revolution. You can't have this ideal of a carefree existence of casual encounters with men and women hooking up however they feel like, and it doesn't have to mean anything. Because, well, of course, sex is personal. It happens between persons, and it begets new persons. And only by violently erasing that can the sexual revolution be plausible.
Yeah.
And then, of course, that violence has repercussions all throughout relationships between men and women. It shapes our culture, shapes our self-understanding, and ultimately it's a degradation of our humanity. As I've said, like, abortion hardens hearts. It doesn't stop.
Yeah. And you would think that we would have stopped at the depravity of becoming the authors of our eventual extinction by means of killing our progeny. But we didn't stop there. We then had to take it steps further into virtually complete misanthropy and now castration. This entire transgender movement hinges upon the willful destruction of otherwise healthy reproductive faculties. And so you're highlighting the story of Chloe as one such example.
Yes, Chloe Cole, who's one of the most prominent detransitioners, who was surgically mutilated at 15 years old. She was still a child, but was given a double mastectomy because she thought she was a boy. And we're seeing progress on this issue, thankfully, but there is still a lot of resistance and a long way to go. And what connects all of this is the denial of natural law and the denial that our bodies have any intrinsic meaning. The same ideology that says who you sleep with doesn't matter because your bodies don't really matter except for the subjective pleasure you get from them, also then says Well, you can reshape your bodies according to your subjective desire. They, again, don't have any intrinsic purpose or meaning.
As a fellow appreciator, I picked up the quotes of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self in your book. And as a fellow appreciator of Truman's, frankly, seminal work, I have to say that the moment we willingly jettisoned objective morality to everything pertaining to the human body, foundations of truth, sexuality, it's no wonder we started this spiral. So first with the validation of the LGBTQ movement, and sex can be whatever you want, whenever you want, redefining marriage, and now the trans movement, and we're not going to stop there. You would think that we would have stopped at some point, but the depravity is going to continue.
I think it will. And yes, Carl Truman, just side note, wonderful and just honored to have him as a colleague. He's a great intellect. But I will say it won't stop, except one, we can hope for God's grace, and two, we can also hope that the harms, which is what I spend a lot of this book on, of the sexual revolution prompt a reevaluation. Because I do turn to a hopeful note, which is that there is a better way to live.
Right.
And that is what Christians can offer the world right now. The people who are left empty by the sexual revolution may have hope for something better.
Yep. And that is the true liberation, to live as we ought, not the freedom to do whatever we want. Nathanael, thank you very much. Real honor to have spoken with you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
My guest, Nathanael Blake, author of Victims of the Revolution, How Sexual Liberation Hurts Us All, published by Ignatius Press. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.